Okay, we are calling to order the Policy Committee meeting on Tuesday, October 14th, 6:19. Okay, do we need to take roll call, Bonnie? Okay, all committee members are here except for Willard Hooks. I will open it for public comment. I'm not seeing anybody. Bonnie, did you have anything? Okay. And then we just need to approve the minutes from August 11th, 2025. I don't have any adjustments to the minutes. Molly, was there anything from you?
No.
Okay, so then I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so then we will just open up our discussion for our two policies that we have to look at. So tonight we have to look at policies 7200 and 7210. That's the suspension procedures and the expulsion procedures. So the reason why we're looking at these two policies is because the board has been considering using a hearing officer in the future and has asked us to look at these policies to see how we can adjust the policies to fit the needs of the board while using a hearing officer. So I will pass this over to Dr. Barrett. Maybe he can explain some of the changes that we can potentially make to the policy.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a few things, and it might be easier to talk through some of these. So I've disconnecting. Okay, well, as Stephanie said, we've had a lot of discussion about this potential use of a hearing officer, and ultimately the board suggested bringing it back to the policy committee to talk about this, because I think one of the questions on the table was about the potential use of a hearing officer had to do with, are we technically kind of doubling up work if we did this? And then another question I feel like was, would we as a board kind of be passing the buck or kind of not giving parents that opportunity to communicate with the board as outlined in the policy? So I took the liberty of drafting up a couple of potential ideas that I thought this committee could talk through, and then if you wanted to give me guidance on going back to getting more information or kind of vetting these through our attorneys, or just liking one and wanting to send it directly to the board, we could. So the language that I've kind of drafted up for discussion today is similar for both policies, but I think we should talk about them separately and differently, because I think the policies candidly are very different. And I would say, honestly, my observation and the kind of sense I have from talking about this with others in terms of our attorneys and other superintendents and other administrators is that really, a suspension is kind of a lower threshold or a lower bar than expulsion or potential action in lieu of an expulsion. That is a very, very big deal. And not that a suspension isn't, but students do get suspended from school from time to time, and a suspension that's part of a disciplinary procedure that may be a day or a couple of days or something like that here and there. While that is significant, and we do believe that is a significant consequence, it's not of the same gravity as a potential expulsion, right? So I think I would say, while we might want to look at these same kind of potential language options for the policy, I would advocate for kind of having a lower threshold for the suspension policy. So here's the language from the suspension policy, and kind of the language in question is right here, where it says, upon request of the parent guardian, a review of the suspension shall be conducted by the board or a hearing officer appointed by the board. And this is kind of where the language stopped, basically, and then that kind of left us with these questions here. So I've kind of got 4 potential options I think that we could think about. One would be you could add language in here that basically says, when it comes to a review of a suspension, for review of suspensions, the board shall designate the superintendent, designee, or a hearing officer to conduct the review. So again, theoretically, the board could say automatically for a suspension, because a suspension is kind of that lower threshold, the board would just say, kind of as a default, the board is going to designate someone else to hear those reviews. And then recall that once those reviews would be conducted by somebody else, they would present their findings to the board, who would then make an ultimate determination, right? So one idea would be to just say, yeah, for any review of suspensions, the board's going to automatically designate some other entity to do that. The next kind of level that we could consider would be to differentiate between 2 different durations of suspension. And the policy already does that, right? So the policy talks about the criteria for and the processes and procedures that the district has to use for suspensions that are 3 days and less, or 4 days or more. So I carried that language through and said potentially you could do the same thing, right? And say for review of suspensions that are 3 days or less, the board could just automatically defer to one of those other entities. Or for suspensions that are 4 days or more, the board could rely on the superintendent to determine whether or not to designate a hearing officer. So that would kind of differentiate between those 2, but still keep that hearing officer in play. I guess as a little B.1, you could also say for suspensions of 4 days or more, the board would want to conduct the review, right? You could theoretically change any of this. This is just all language I'm putting out there for discussion. A third option would be to note that if a suspension review is conducted by a hearing officer, the student and his or her parent or guardian may provide a written statement to the board for consideration along with the hearing officer's report. And I think that would be a step towards some of the comments we heard from our board colleagues about making sure the family has kind of knows that the board is hearing from them, right? And then an additional option that should be D, not E, would say that when a suspension review is conducted by a hearing officer, the student and his or her parent guardian may elect to appear before the board to provide a statement for the board's consideration along with the hearing officer's report. So basically what you would do is you would theoretically kind of pick for suspension reviews anyway. You would pick either kind of A or B or a modified version of A or B, and then theoretically pick C or D to go along with it, if that makes sense. So you would either say, for a suspension, we're automatically going to do a hearing officer, but folks can provide a statement, or for a suspension, we're automatically going to do a hearing officer, but folks may elect to come and share a statement with the board along with the hearing officer's report, or that day differentiation thing. So that's kind of what I drafted up as potential options on the suspension review side. Clear as mud?
It does make sense. I did have a question. So where it says board shall designate the superintendent, designee, or hearing officer, can we be specific that it's just a hearing officer?
For sure.
Okay.
For sure. I kind of put all 3 of those in there as options.
Okay.
But you could absolutely just say automatically it's a hearing officer.
Just so that it gives our parents. I assume that in most situations, maybe not most, but some of the situations you are already involved at some point. So it
Generally
gives
correct, yes.
them someone else.
Yes, correct. I think you're right, Stephanie. I think generally speaking, if a suspension were to get to, this level where someone wanted to request a formal review, it's highly likely I've already been part of that and theoretically tried to serve as that reviewer.
Right.
And someone is still choosing to formally escalate it beyond my review, right? So yeah, you could absolutely just formally say if it gets to this point where someone's doing a review, it's going to go to a hearing officer.
I do like the B option because we do have a differentiation in the rest of the policy about 3 days versus 4 days. And to me personally, a 3-day suspension versus 4 days feels different.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that there could be a different consideration.
I might also add, the language about a review for a suspension is a little bit new with some legislation that happened a couple years back. When we've talked about expulsion hearings, which is different than a suspension review, and I'll keep harping on that. But when we talk about suspension hearings, I think I have a little more advocacy in this one, I think, than when it comes to expulsions. Because, again, the reality is that kids get suspended here in any public school district. And I would advocate for the use of a hearing officer for suspension reviews, and noting that explicitly going forward, because I'm not sure the board has the capacity if this got to a place where folks were like every suspension running up the flagpole all the way to the board. Historically, that hasn't happened, but if it did, I'm not sure that the board could have the capacity to conduct a formal review of, every suspension. Again, not that I think that would necessarily rise to that in all instances, but that's just a lot to consider. So I would advocate for use of a hearing officer should the need arise under the suspension policy. And so then considering one of those options with either C or D if the board felt strongly about that. And we can talk about the potential for expulsion policy in a minute.
That was actually one of my questions that I had written down, and if you know it offhand, great. If not, that's okay too. In general, like what percentage of suspensions have a parent or guardian request a review?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on kind of what Stephanie said. What do we consider a review?
Mm-hmm.
I would say a good chunk of them have someone who would like to challenge the veracity of it.
Sure.
And elevate that to someone else's attention. In many instances, that might just end up being, well, at the middle or high school level, it goes to the principal, or at that sometimes at that building level, if it's been done by the principal, that might come to me. And then often, as Stephanie said, those are kind of, that's more or less considered the review, and it kind of stops there. It is pretty rare that a suspension, someone seeks a formal, goes to this policy to seek a formal review of a suspension in front of this board, but not unheard of, as I think you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do also think about our suspension procedures and how we do get reports on that monthly.
Yep.
So that the board is aware of the suspensions that are happening and even though that doesn't include specific information about who that suspension pertained to, it does give us the data on that.
Yep.
So we're still staying on top of the suspensions in the district. And we see a lot of the issues that come up through suspensions, and it might be a 1-day suspension, a lot of in-school suspensions and things like that. But there are times that call for the use of a suspension. And I know you guys do deal with sometimes if there's pushback on that and walking families through why that was the choice that was made and handling that.
Yeah.
I also think if it did become the case where we were asked to review more because something changed, that might make it more difficult for us to stay consistent in taking in all the information, because each case could have so many different layers, and us considering all those
Right.
different layers that we may not be experts on. We aren't educators, we aren't special education experts, all those different factors.
Yeah, and to your point, that's a lot of what happens with some of the layers, right? If a student has an IEP, for example, different folks might have to be involved in discussion about that process, and so there are just a lot of layers in that.
I do like the option of adding an opportunity for parents to either write a statement or come and share a statement if they so choose. That still leaves that option. Which personally I kind of feel like the written statement might be enough, but I don't know if we think that giving them a chance to come and speak.
Well, keep in the back of your head too, like basically these same general options, with a little bit of tweaking. It's kind of what we should be considering for the expulsion hearing too, right? So think something with a higher bar. Which of these might you want to include if we were going to include any of those?
Oh yeah, I see what you're
You
saying.
see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so if for suspension, because that's a lower threshold, something that may be used more often, we just stuck with, we have the hearing officer, and then of course we still approve that. And then after that, for the expulsions, where we would allow the review.
Right. Or where, yeah.
Or I
where
mean,
you
we
would
allow
a
the
statement.
statement, sorry,
Correct.
yes.
Or you could say a written statement for a suspension and allow for an in-person statement.
Statement for,
A written or an in-person statement, and,
right. Yes, because the thing about the written statement is that we will have to still read the hearing officer's report on it. So if there's one more thing in there, would that be too much more to add? But yeah, I do like the idea that we would handle these differently based on severity and the frequency of use, I think.
Molly, I feel like you had some questions when we talked about it as a whole board about the use of the hearing officer. Do you feel like these address this or not really?
I do, and I apologize. I'm a little quiet right now because
No, don't apologize.
marinating
No,
on
take
your
everything.
time.
Yeah, don't.
I think I think I'm a little bit more on the other side where I hold maybe the stance of we are an elected board by the community and have a duty and an obligation to be present in these kinds of matters. And I recognize that, just our, availability and how much we can actually take on, and, the argument of expertise comes in. I don't know if anybody looks to the Board of Education in a district as the experts on all the things, because we're community members elected. I think by nature, we all bring in different subsets of interest and expertise. So I'm trying to kind of grapple with the idea of, I like the lower threshold, maybe having the hearing officer involved. I think personally hold firm to the board has to be accessible on when it comes to matters of expulsion. So I know that's going to be the next
Sure.
policy that we bring up. I'm definitely open, like I said, to the hearing officer. Yeah, I guess just trying to make sense of kind of how, I think the written statement is something that we need to keep in, because that too, I think parents, we all want to be heard.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of the day, we want to be heard. And yes, a hearing officer would be that entity to hear. However, that might feel a little disconnected from their student's situation, you know, so having that avenue to, yes, the hearing officer heard me, but I still want the board to hear me as well. I think that written statement is crucial.
So I think that I hear your points completely, and that's kind of like where I've been thinking about it too. I think that although like maybe people don't look at us as experts because we are elected community members essentially, like we are the same as if you picked up 7 random strangers off the street and said, what should we do about this kid? It would essentially be the same, because that's what we are, related to education. Where I feel really strongly about it is that we're still talking about kids here. So even though maybe their parents coming and is not expecting us to be the expert, I don't know, that child, we're still making a decision for a child that we are not an expert in that case matter, whether that's early childhood development, education, special education, whatever that might be. And then I also think about like the other students that are involved in all these situations, and is it fair to them that 7 strangers get to decide what happens to someone who may have done something to them, or that a case that they're involved in? And to our staff and administrators who have worked to really work with these students to like make it better. So that's where I grapple, is how are we meeting like all the stakeholders' needs, and are we equipped to do that with our limited knowledge?
Yeah, I think another thing you could do here, again, when we're talking specifically about review of suspension, you know, if the yellow language is the language that's already in the policy, right? And some of, like this option A and option B are basically in there as assuming that the default in this language is a review conducted by the board. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the default in practice, right? And I would share with you candidly, in most districts, that's not the default. Right. In most districts, the default for something like this would be automatically would be a hearing officer for a suspension review, because it's laid out right here in the policy that a review of the suspension shall be conducted by the board or a hearing officer appointed by the board. So one thing you could do is just keep this language, understand that, and we would communicate it here in practice, that by default for a suspension, that review is going to be conducted by a hearing officer, and then just include this language on top of that, right? So you would say, upon request by the parent guardian, a review of the suspension shall be conducted by the board or a hearing officer. When a suspension review is conducted by a hearing officer, the student and his or her parent may provide a written statement to the board in consideration along with the hearing officer's report. That leaves the door open for, say, the superintendent to, number one, say, no, I think this review should be conducted by the full board instead of just a hearing officer. And B, to Molly's point, have the opportunity for that statement from a family, you know, should they want to provide that in addition to the hearing officer's report. Because do remember that they will have a lot of face time with the hearing officer as well, who will be providing that report as a agent of the school district, right? Ultimately, like that's someone we will have hired to conduct this, to do on your behalf. So that's an option too. I just feel like I just keep adding options. I'm sorry. And I should have said this at the beginning too. Obviously, we've spent plenty of time on this. We don't have to decide any of this today.
Yeah.
So these could be things we're just going to ruminate on today, and then have some time to go talk about and process before the next policy committee meeting.
It might be helpful, at least for me, to walk through the expulsion procedures too, just
Yep.
so I can have the comparison before landing on a very firm kind of
Yeah.
opinion on it.
So, that's cool.
Yep.
Okay. So basically, again, we kind of have a similar process. Now, remember, when it comes to an expulsion is a much bigger deal, right? And an expulsion doesn't require a review; it requires a formal hearing. That formal hearing, this is what the policy says. Policy 7210 are expulsion procedures. That formal hearing is required no matter what, not just if someone requests it. If the district is going to move forward with a potential expulsion, a hearing is automatically required. Doesn't matter if the family requests it or not. You have to do that no matter what. So if that hearing, if you're going to have that hearing, the policy says, again, this is the language in the policy in yellow, that hearing shall be conducted by the board or a hearing officer. And it says already in the policy, if a hearing officer is appointed, he or she shall report to the board evidence presented at the hearing, and the board shall take such final action as it is appropriate. So again, you got to have that hearing no matter what, and we kind of have the same potential language options. You could say, listen, for any such hearings, the board is going to rely on the superintendent to determine whether or not to designate a hearing officer to conduct the hearing, right? That could be one thing. Another would be to tack onto that language like we've talked about before. When a hearing is conducted by a hearing officer, the student and his or her parent may provide that written statement, or you could also include that option of them having an opportunity to come in person and provide an in-person statement on the same night that the board is going to consider the hearing officer's report. And in that way, you could theoretically meld both of the things you two are kind of talking about, right? You could meld that kind of expertise, knowledge piece with the report from the hearing officer, plus that opportunity to be a representative of the community and have the parent be able to have face time here with the board. So those are kind of the options under the expulsion procedures.
Is it too much to have language for the family to make the decision if they want a hearing officer or the board to review? Is that, is that opening up too many weeds?
That's a fair question. I think my honest opinion is yes.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we want to have explicit and consistent criteria that we would use in any of those circumstances. And I also think that, to be honest, there might be some circumstances where on our end, for example, a case that has a lot of unique nuances behind it, a case that involves a lot of different departments and maybe, students with unique needs and all that kind of stuff, those might be just the types of cases where I might say a hearing officer is most important, because they would come with that much more institutional knowledge and expertise, for the best interest of the kid involved, right? Not just the board and the community, but for the best interest of the kid involved. And then to have that be the situation where the parent says, well, I just want to talk to the board instead. I think that would open up a room for some inconsistency, at least the way it is now, right? We're doing it the same every time we're gonna do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of why these other options I thought were either you say the board's just going to conduct the hearings like we're doing right now, or you say a hearing officer is going to conduct the hearings, but here's the way we're going to give the parent or guardian kind of an opportunity to communicate their message directly with the board. And again, remembering that the suspension and the expulsion are two different things, and I would advocate for thinking about them in two different ways, with kind of that lower threshold being the suspension.
I do also wonder, like from a legal perspective, like what would be recommended from a lawyer for, like if we said, because of that consistency piece, like if we said it was up to the family. I'm not obviously a legal expert, so I don't know. But
Yeah, I think we've talked throughout these conversations, I think from a legal perspective, when I talk to any of our attorneys, they would advocate in any circumstance that they would advocate a hearing officer over a hearing directly with the board from a legal perspective.
from a legal perspective,
That's what they would argue. But
which is
they're not
also,
making the decision. The board is. So
and that's more consistent with what other districts are do as well.
by and large, that's my understanding, yeah. So, another thing that we could do here is, you guys could have some opportunity to process this a little more, and provide me with some feedback before our next policy committee meeting. And I could kind of take that feedback and come forward to the next policy committee meeting with an actual recommendation for each of these two policies and say, based on all of our discussions, based on what I've heard from, you guys, theoretically, the rest of our board member colleagues will have the opportunity to watch this riveting policy committee meeting on the YouTube and provide their insights and feedback as well. And, I could do what I candidly have not done up to this point, which is just come forward and say, based on all that feedback, based on everything that I've learned up until this point in the process, here's my proposed recommendations for policy 7200 and policy 7210. And they would obviously, I think you can tell I'm channeling, they would be different recommendations
Right.
for each of those two policies. But I'd be happy to do that way too, if that would help.
Yeah, I would definitely like the opportunity to do a little more research, because I think, and just, openly, I think for me I know Stephanie, you mentioned like the phrase 7 strangers. I don't look at us as 7 strangers. It's our duty to know the policies and to be informed on practices, and having the district hire a hearing officer, the optics behind it is it's still somebody hired through, we're elected by. So I think that's just where I would like to do a little bit more personal digging and understanding. But yeah, I would appreciate the, coming with some recommendations and an opportunity to come back to this in our next policy meeting.
Yeah, I think that works fine for me as well. I think it might be helpful if you ran whatever the policy recommendation was by our lawyers.
Yeah,
and
I would
could
absolutely do that.
share that with us, and even if they can share their opinion on what other districts they work with are doing and why, so we can help understand that. And I can do some research for the policy committee as well to see like what are other districts doing, so we can kind of see a count, because sometimes I think it makes total sense to be the only one doing something different, and sometimes we have to question why that is, and are we doing that for the right reasons, and how do we build our policies around that. So, and yeah, I think if then we come with a recommendation and then we vote on it, like there's sometimes a disagreements in opinion, and then that's how we ultimately proceed. So
Yeah.
and that's okay.
Okay, so I'll give you guys some time to process and look into some things, and I'll do so as well. And again, I'll try to find some ways to get get feedback from folks and see if we can come forward with some recommendations and additional information at our next policy committee meeting.
Sounds great.
Is that good?
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So then moving on for information, we don't have anything for this evening. And then outstanding policy cleanup and review, nothing for that. So we will adjourn the meeting. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everybody.